Hi, welcome back. In this video, we will finalize the transition of dynamic form controls to their separate components. So what the issue is remaining? Well, currently we temporarily unbound the native form controls from the form control models. So now the control data, validators and other things, they are not being synchronized. As you know from the previous section of the course, in order to bind native control with a particular form control model, we have to use special directives. In the case of reactive forms, it is the form control name directive, and the value of it needs to be a control key. And of course, we need to import the reactive forms module as well. So let's quickly do that. Though we have no build errors, the error will happen when we will try to run it in the browser. According to the error message, it is because the form control name directive is supposed to be used only as a child of the form group directive, and what is even more important, it should be used in the same view. If you check the source code of this form control name directive, you can clearly see that it tries to inject a parent group that might be either some nested form group or the root form group, and both of them are represented as a control container token, which is also a base class for form group directive and form group name directive as well. But it is not so important for now. The most important thing is that it is annotated with the host resolution modifier. And this resolution modifier restricts the resolution in the scope of the host view, where the form control name directive is declared. So if in the scope of this view there is no provider for control container, then it will fail, as we already have seen. Before, things were working because everything was happening inside the same view. So the form control name directive was traversing the tree of node injectors up and up until it reached the form group instance and resolve it. And because it was within the same view host, everything was working fine. So from it, we can conclude that our controls needs to be wrapped with the form group directive. And this is a correct assumption. So let's create a new ng container somewhere right here, and then we just attach the form group directive to this newly created ng control, just like that. And then the input itself, we have to move inside the container, so the form control name directive is wrapped by the form group. Now we have to somehow get a reference to the parent form group instance and provide it as a value for the form group directive. So how we can do that? Well, we could try to provide it within the config object as we did it for the control data, but there is a better way. Actually, we could use again the Angular dependency injection, and we could inject the instance of the parent form group directive, and from there we could read a control property that contains the instance of the form group we need. So I just inject the control container right here, and it's going to point, as I said, to the parent form group directive instance, and there I can create a getter that will read and return the control property from the directive form group directive instance, and this control property contains the instance of the parent form group model that we actually need, and then this value we can use right here in the template. So in theory, when the component will be created and start to resolve the control container, it will be trying to resolve this dependency in its own injector. Then if it cannot find it, then it goes to the parent injector. Then if it cannot find also in parent injector, it goes to the parent of the parent injector, and so on until it finds the form group here and resolves the appropriate provider for the control container, which eventually points to the directive instance. So I hope it is clear. Yeah, if not, please let me know, and I will try to find maybe another words to describe this process. But okay, it is just a theory. But what do we have in practice? In practice, we have an error that was thrown in the console. And this error indicates that dynamic input component could not find the provider for the control container token. Which is sad because our assumption was so nice and clean actually. But the truth is that we are on the right track. The problem is actually with the parent injector that we created for the dynamic components. Do you remember I told you that the component tries to resolve the control container in its own injector first, then it goes to the parent one, which is exactly the one we create right here in the pipe. And if it doesn't find the provider here, and it doesn't because we only have a provider for control data token, and because in this injector there is no provider for the control container token, this injector tries to resolve it in its own parent. And here is the trick. By default, the parent injector for this new injector that we create is null injector, which indicate the end of the injector hierarchy, and it just throws the error we saw in the console. So we slightly broke the injector chain, and Angular doesn't traverse the injectors above and doesn't find the form group that has an appropriate provider. But fortunately, we can easily fix it. Right here in the pipe, we can just inject the closest injector which contains a proper injector chain, and we can define it explicitly as a parent for this new injector. And we can do it by using a dedicated property in the injector config. As easy as that. Now we can go to the browser and try to load the form one more time. And you can see that the form has been loaded without any errors. And if I try to enter some invalid value to the form, you can see that it works fine and validators were involved as well. Sure, the select component isn't working yet, so let's try to adjust it as well. For that, first of all, I have to import the reactive forms module. Next, I have to wrap the native control with ng container like we did before for the dynamic input. And yeah, let's create it right now, move everything inside, and then let's apply the form group directive. And then the code that resolves the form group instance, we can actually go and take from the dynamic input component. So I copied, and let's go back and place it here. And also let's provide the form group instance here for the form group directive. Great. Now the last step I forgot is to bind the native control with the appropriate model using the form control name directive. Now we are finally ready to test if everything works. So let's go to the browser and try to load the form. And you can see that it is loaded fine without any issues. Then I just fill out the form in order to make it completely valid. And once I submit the button, you can see that the form data was properly resolved and printed out. Awesome. But before we go, I would like to suggest another improvement. If we go to the dynamic controls, we can find a lot of repetitive stuff like injecting and resolving of control container or injecting the control data. And the same thing, obviously, we can find also in the dynamic input component. And even more, when you need to introduce a new control type, you would need to copy this logic also there, otherwise it will not work. So my suggestion is to create a base class that will hold this logic, and other derived classes, they will be just extending that base class. So let's create it somewhere, maybe next to dynamic inputs, like that. I think it should be fine. And from here, I just export the following class, which, by the way, needs to be decorated with directive annotation if this class will be extended by some Angular component class. Okay. Now all the logic from the dynamic input should go here inside the base class. And also let's add all required imports. Here we go. And then we can go to the dynamic input and extend this component with this base dynamic control class. Okay, so it looks like we don't need ng, only need lifecycle hooks, so let's remove it as well. And also let's clean up the imports and remove unused classes from there. Now, as you can see, it looks way cleaner as before. And then we have to do the same refactoring also for the dynamic select component, right? So let's go there. And again, I'm going to remove everything from the class body, and let's just extend the base dynamic control class right here. Fantastic. And then I just have to perform the import cleaning up like that. Here we go. And also I can remove also those small things. Cool, it looks now way cleaner, though the form remains working. And if we check it in the browser again, we can see that the form is loaded fine and all other features, they are also working, which is really, really cool.